The FB-04 Halberd is a plane that can do anything. Interceptor and air defense? Check. With a ferry range of easily over 5,000 kilometers, a loiter time of over 1 hour, and the speed of an F-15, as well as the ability to carry up to 10 medium-range air-to-air missiles, air superiority is nothing short of a breeze. Ground attack craft? Check. With a top speed of over 1.2 on the deck, as well as the ability to mount ground attack weapons on these unique swiveling pylons, the Halberd truly lives up to its name. Combining long ranges and high speeds with a heavy-hitting payload, the Halberd could strike longer, faster, and harder than its opponents. That, combined with an easy-to-use cockpit with a specific dedicated mode for both air-to-air and air-to-ground, you'll make sure your pilots have the advantage at all times. Nuclear capabilities? Check. The Halberd was just as capable of carrying nuclear weapons as it was conventional. It was truly a force to be reckoned with. Hello everybody, it's Messier82 and welcome back to another Flyout video. For those of you who are new here, the game I am using is Flyout. It's essentially just a hyper-realistic aircraft building simulator that isn't quite released to the public yet, but don't worry, it's gearing up for release as soon as the developer works on this massive update currently known as 0.207. I won't talk about it too much, and I sure can't promise this will be the last update before release, especially considering there may be multiple patches after the update, as well as who knows, he might even work on another update. I really don't know the developer's schedule, but it looks like the actual content of the game is basically about to double with this update, so I'm pretty excited for that. But before any of that, and before release, I still want to put out some rather serious attempted stock vehicles. The Halberd makes my fourth submission, a late 60s swing-wing fighter bomber. With an over 10 meter long afterburner plume, the 1.24 meter diameter engines, they reached a noise level of about 149 decibels on full afterburner. This very shouty and very gigantic aircraft was a fighter bomber, so it was sorta to be expected. For those of you guys who have been asking for a swing wing since the beginning, congratulations, it's finally here. So what exactly makes the Halberd so special? Well, let's take a look. Also, before we do that, special thank you to Alexandros on my Discord for the intro music. And for these outlines, of course, credit to NYTROL on my Discord server. Anyways, getting on with it, the very first thing we need to look at is dimensions of this aircraft. With a length of over 22 meters including the nose probe, the Halberd was certainly a very large aircraft. For those of you measuring an Imperial, that's over 70 feet long. Its gigantic wingspan was over 62 feet or 19 meters fully extended as well. Luckily, due to the wing system, the Halberd could fold into a significantly smaller space of only about 10 meters or about 33 feet, meaning that it could be stored in even smaller spaces. The second seat was mostly reserved for operating air-to-ground munitions, but could also function as a RIO and operate the air-to-air systems in any required situations. This is a similar setup to what you might expect to see on the F-15E, for example. The aircraft was also a swing wing. The wings were automatically controlled by an onboard computer for optimal wing sweep during turns, but could also be manually taken over to extend the wings or retract them for storage. The wings were designed with flaps covering the entire trailing edge, allowing for the most lift and drag possible during landing. To both reduce wing loading and increase high-speed maneuverability, a large leading edge extension moved from the front of the aircraft near the cockpit and extended all the way down into the tail booms past the trailing edge of the main wing. This allowed for incredible amounts of vortex lift and lifting body, therefore optimizing the aircraft for the most lift possible, albeit a little disrupted by the rear landing gear. A dogtooth was also included in the main wing for this exact reason. This was expressed especially later on when we felt that the aircraft had a wing loading of around 150 kilograms per meter squared, at least at a minimum. Two large diameter afterburning turbofans were included in the back of the aircraft that provided optimal thrust and could propel the aircraft up to Mach 2.5, rivaling even the F-15 in speed and range. Rotating pylons were also mounted up and down the wings. These pylons, as well as the heavier main fuselage pylons, allowed the Halberd to carry over 15 tons of ordnance. This could include air-to-air missiles, air-to-ground munitions, or drop tanks. No matter what the task was, the Halberd was ready for it. Speaking of armament, a large tri-barreled rotary 30mm cannon was included in this design. With 1,200 rounds of ammunition and a very high rate of fire, the gun on this aircraft rivaled the A-10's gun in sheer power and capability. Strafing runs should be no problem with such a weapon. On the topic of ordnance, it could also carry multiple weapons in an internal weapons bay stowed just behind the cockpit. Past that, with a limited fly-by-wire system, advanced avionics, and navigation equipment, a working autopilot system, RWR, countermeasures, and multiple redundant nose-mounted sensors and equipment, the Halberd was equipped with leading-edge technology to be expected on an advanced fighter bomber. And that just about covers all the elements of the Halberd's design. Now let's go on to explain how the aircraft was built. Of course, as you've been seeing, the first thing I started with was the nose fuselage and the cockpit. The purpose of this was to get the length of the aircraft correct before moving on, but I accidentally ended building it a bit larger than I wanted to. And correction, not nose, fuselage, and cockpit, but nose, fuselage, and engines. The next thing was building the fuselage around the engines along with the leading edge extensions and tail booms. As mentioned before, this aircraft would take advantage of vortex lift, which is one of the most important features of all modern fighter aircraft in design. You see, when your wing has a very high sweep angle, it doesn't move through the air in the same way as a traditional aircraft would. Where on a traditional wing, the air would move over the top and generate lift via the Venturi effect, a high sweep angle wing acts a little bit differently. The high angle wing disrupts the air along the leading edge, generating spirals as it travels down the body. It's the same reason, for example, a large box truck on the highway can pull you inwards if you're too close to the rear. Those disrupted spirals per se generate an area of low pressure above the wing, therefore pulling the plane upwards and generating lift in a rather unconventional way. The larger the lifting body behind these spirals is, the more lift will be generated. This is why the F-16, for example, has such a large tail boom behind its leading edge extension. There are some drawbacks to this style of lift, of course. Firstly, you're gonna need AOA to generate lift. In other words, if the wing isn't angled upwards slightly or doesn't have some sort of incidence with the air, it won't be generating any lift. Luckily, this is basically the least of our concerns, as fighter jets by nature, just about every actual aircraft by nature, are almost always pointed slightly above their velocity vectors. Of course, turning will also lead to an immediate increase in lift if not. Our second problem is more of a flyout problem than it is a problem with the leading edge itself, and that's kind of just because wings don't interact with each other. You see, on a normal swing wing design, the vortices would travel down the main wing as well once it becomes steeply angled. The problem is, since these two wing pieces need to be separated in flyout, they can no longer interact with each other. You see, in flyout, since you can make multiple sort of wing piece segments of a single wing, it just takes the whole wing piece shape that you finish making and generates the aerodynamic effects of that. So if you have like a lurks leading into a main wing that is connected, the aerodynamics of each piece will influence each other. With a swing wing, they can't be connected since the swinging part is on a separate joint. This unfortunately means the wings will not influence each other and I will end up losing a great deal of lift. I had this same problem earlier with my supersonic airliner build. Believe me folks, if there was a way around this I would use it, but there is not at the moment and there's likely not to be one for a while without special wing pieces exclusively built for swing wings, so we'll have to deal with just a little bit less lift. But honestly, ultimately, it doesn't really affect us that badly, it's still nearly perfect. To wrap up the basic aerodynamic design of the aircraft, 2 vertical stabilizers as well as ventral stabilizers were included on the aircraft that came complete with eventually static wicks, an RWR sensor, and a strobe light for anti-collision, as well as a nav light on the other one, can't forget to mention that. A powerful front-mounted radar was simulated in the craft as well. Since radars at the moment weren't in game, a large battery was instead mounted in the front to simulate the weight of a radar in the nose as well as providing extra electrical power. You can see this radar later in the video. It is marked by a dark gray radome and includes 2 small ram air intakes for radar cooling just before the radome. Because, you know, even in the game without radars, I'm gonna simulate the cooling of the radar. You know what, that's something that needs to be talked about more. Arguably the most important part of the modern fighter jet is the radar. Having good cooling systems, power, and radar technology is one of the most important things you can include on your aircraft, especially in the modern age. But let's move on. Let's say, for example, the intakes on this aircraft were designed as ramp intakes. They were placed relatively far back on this design to avoid the vortex of the leading edge as it travels down the main wing route and tail booms. Similar designs can be seen on the F-18 for example, and is placed here presumably to avoid compressor stalls during negative rate maneuvers. Next, the intakes were shaped with a ramp style to optimize the airflow for any speed as it enters the engine. A boundary layer diffuser was included both outside and inside the intake. This essentially skimmed off any of the dirty air that could be entering the intake to optimize engine performance as well as increase its effective lifespan. The engines were designed as two large diameter afterburning 2-spool turbofan engines, with a bypass ratio of nearly 1:1 and a compression ratio of nearly 27:1. Most of that air was dumped straight into the afterburners to produce as much thrust at both low and high speeds as possible. As a result, the engines did drink quite a lot of fuel, but also propelled the aircraft to incredible speeds, especially for its size. Unfortunately, however, its thrust to weight remained rather low at about 0.7:1, even lower when it's fully loaded, but its highly aerodynamic design allowed for a supersonic zero-lift drag coefficient of approximately 0.12, which is incredibly good. This combination of moderate thrust to weight but very low drag coefficient allowed the aircraft to reach speeds greater than Mach 2.5 and could even travel at moderate supersonic speeds for over an hour due to its ability to supercruise at any altitude. Next things next was the armament. A tri-barreled 30mm rotary cannon was included in the wing root firstly. This, accompanied by 1,200 rounds of ammunition, was sure to deal with any threat it may come across, air-to-air or air-to-ground. 6 wing-mounted pylons, 4 MRAM slots in the fuselage along with an internal weapons bay meant that our fighter could carry over 15 tons of ordnance. And let's talk about just that, our ordnance and internal weapons bay. Unfortunately, actual nuclear weapons and whatnot were not added as, those weapons editors aren't in Flyout at the moment, and I wasn't about to just play make-believe with you guys just yet. But possibly the greatest feat of this aircraft was its ability to carry nuclear bombs. Using the B-61 thermonuclear gravity bomb and the AGM-69 nuclear air-to-ground missile as reference, this thing could carry well over 14 nuclear munitions on just one aircraft and still have room to spare for either drop tanks or missiles. That's ultimately what this thing was. It wasn't quite worth it to think of it as a fighter aircraft, but more so a lightweight bomber aircraft, hence the designation. Its target pod carrying capabilities allowed for precision strikes, whereas its 15-ton carrying capacity allowed it to follow through with heavy precision strikes of conventional or nuclear variety. With some final touches on the aircraft, some final antennae, a camouflage inspired by the RAF Woodland camo, and a front and rear cockpit designed with both air-to-air and air-to-ground in mind, the Halberd nuclear fighter bomber was ready to fly. See you guys in the air.